This is Identity at the Center.
Welcome to the Identity at the Center podcast. I'm Jeff, and that's Jim. Hey, Jim.
Hey, Jeff, how are you?
Oh, not so bad yourself?
Good. I'm wearing my baseball hat. It's going to come up in the lighter note as to why I'm doing that. So people are going to have to stick around to the end to find out.
Yeah. I'm sure there will be plenty of discussion. I'm just kind of like going to hand it off to you at that point. Be like, all right, it's time for a lighter note, and take it away, Jim, because I think I'm pretty well established at this point that I am not a baseball fan.
Yeah, I think we all know that. You're an identity fan.
I am an identity fan. And, like others that probably listen to this podcast, a lot of identity fans that are out there. Today, we do have a sponsored episode. We're sponsored by Strivacity. We're going to talk with Stephen Cox here in a minute, but just make it clear, right? This entire episode is sponsored by them. We appreciate that. That's how we're able to do, first of all, so many podcasts, one every week, attend conferences, and really get kind of insights from the different folks that we talk to. And Stephen is no stranger to this. He's been with us multiple times. So let me go ahead and get him on here. But again, Strivacity, you can find him on the web, strivacity.com. I'll have that link in our show notes so people can check it out there as well. But let's welcome Stephen. He's the co-founder and chief technology officer at Strivacity. Welcome back to the show, Stephen.
Thanks so much. It's good to see you guys. Okay, so you've done 400 plus episodes now, of which I have done 3.
Yep,
so
you have a third timer jacket coming to you from Jim.
Oh, wow. Okay, so where do I rank on the return guest meter? I guess
I would say to come back on any more than 2 or 3 times that means we like you. We like all of our guests.
Oh,
but
okay.
The fact that you've come back and now this is your second time sponsoring episode, we definitely love that. So thanks for that. That definitely greases the wheels.
Absolutely. All right,
we
that
met
makes
you
me feel good.
Way back in the past. Like you've seen this podcast grow over the years. We met in episode 112 back in 2021. Mm-hmm. And then we talked to you again in your first sponsored episode in episode 317 in 2024. Mm-hmm. Now you're back for another sponsored episode here in 2026.
Yeah.
So you've actually kind of seen this thing grow, which is nuts.
Totally. Yeah. Seeing you guys go from, a podcast trying to sort of get off the ground to like complete celebrities at Identiverse, right? So
yeah, I struggle with that, but you could argue, I think we're still trying to get it off the ground, but it'll never be good enough for me.
There you go.
So we had you on before, we talked about Strivacity, but just to kind of refresh memories, give us a little bit about Strivacity, what you guys are up to, and what are some of the problems that you look to solve in the market?
Absolutely. So we're a customer identity, a CIAM platform. We help companies manage how customers do things like register or authenticate or access services, sort of further back, within their applications. So, most consumer-facing systems need a reliable way to handle things like registration, login, account recovery, identity verification, but they need to do it in a way that scales to millions of users in the customer side, right? You have a much larger scale for customers. And you also have to meet data privacy expectations. And so our role is to provide that infrastructure so companies don't have to build and maintain it themselves. And in practice, that means we're an identity provider, an authorization server, and we handle the identity layer for these businesses. And so we recently announced support for AI agents within our platform. So our approach there, and which we're going to talk about a lot today, is like kind of treats AI agents as delegated actors tied to a real user identity. So orgs can sort of authorize what an agent can do, enforce policies around it, and maintain sort of a full chain of accountability between the human down to the agent.
So agentic identity is so hot right now. And that's kind of the thrust of this conversation. Yeah. We did an episode with Tobin South in December of 2025. It's episode 390. And he's the reason you're here. What is it about that episode? Tobin, if you're listening, it's your fault that Stephen has come back. He has something to say in regards to that episode. But what was it about that episode that caught your attention? It's like, hey, I want to talk to you guys about this.
Totally. Yeah. No, I mean, the episode really resonated with me. I thought it was really good. I think Tobin did an awesome job of laying out the challenges that we're facing here, and sort of how fast we're sort of rushing into this. As we sort of move into this agentic model. And, selfishly, a lot of what he talked about kind of maps closely to what we're seeing as well. So, I think, sort of the concept of that we're sort of introducing a new actor into these systems. AI agents can operate on behalf of a person. I really appreciated that he grounded it in existing standards work that he's doing through through OpenID Foundation. Um, One of the things we strongly believe is that this problem doesn't necessarily require inventing an entirely new identity model. A lot of the building blocks are already there in things like OAuth or OpenID Connect. So we really just need to apply them thoughtfully to the agent problem. So hearing him talk about it from the standard side was encouraging to me as well, because that's sort of the pathway we're taking. It shows that the industry is kind of contemplating really good ideas around this. A strong delegation model, constrained authority, you know, th- clear auditability of agent actions, and I think these are things that we're talking about as well. So it just kind of resonated, like, oh wow, we're talking about the same things. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, Jeff and I joke around a lot and call this AI at the center. We're talking about authentication, authorization a lot for AI agents,
Yeah.
but it's mostly on the enterprise workforce side.
Yeah.
And you guys are obviously taking it from the approach of customer IAM. And I
Yeah.
wanted to know, kind of start the conversation with like, why is now the right time to talk about this?
Yeah. So if you kind of look back in history a little bit, AI was sort of mostly helping people do things like research or make decisions, right? Using sort of the chatbot interface. But what we're seeing now is that agents are executing actions on behalf of users, right? And some examples, maybe contrived examples, would be like booking travel, or managing your accounts, or making purchases on your behalf, right? So when you enter a world where like AI starts to act, identity kind of becomes a critical part, because every action must be sort of tied back to the user that authorized it. And so we've created this kind of new type of actor into identity systems. It's not really just humans logging in anymore. Now you have these like agents that are acting for humans. Um, it sort of extends the surface, right, and the potential attack surface, which means that like authentication, delegation, authorization models need to evolve to sort of keep pace with it. Um, and then, following that is liability, especially in the customer side, right? So when you're executing transactions on behalf of customers, the stakes change completely. So if an agent changes a shipping address, or resets an account, or initiates a payment, like, an organization needs to be able to prove who authorized that. What authority the agent had, and why the action was allowed, right? So identity kind of becomes like an accountability layer, in this kind of model. And a really interesting point is that CIAM is kind of where agentic interactions are actually happening right now. So you have, historically we've talked about enterprise or workforce, but like customer identity systems are where real consumer actions are occurring, right? Logins, purchases, support flows. So CIM kind of becomes the place where agents are actually meeting real users, right, and real data. And so that's a really important point to sort of hammer down on. And um, the market narrative is still forming. Um, I think the vendors are sort of framing agents as like this new identity that need authentication, but and the standards and the best practices are still forming. But this is a good moment for vendors like us to shape how agent identity actually works before the patterns solidify, right? So it's a great place for me as a CTO of a vendor, up and coming vendor, to be able to shape, how I think things should work, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, the discussion I think is really interesting. And I philosophically, agents doing things on behalf of people is a lot different. I'm wondering from a mechanics perspective, is there a difference between what AI agents are doing from an authentication authorization standpoint from humans?
From an authorization standpoint, um, yeah. So, let's look at it this way. I mean, agents introduce like a delegated actor, right? And I think that's kind of one of the core concepts to think about is, traditionally, like the actor was almost always the human customer, right? The human themselves. With agentic AI, you now have software that's acting on behalf of a customer, which introduces a delegation model. So the system kind of needs to know who the agent is, who they represent, and what they're allowed to do, right? And that's when you start talking about like the authorization side of it. So um, authorization kind of needs to be more granular here. So humans usually have very broad account permissions once they've logged in. Agents require much tighter controls. So, for example, an agent might be able to like view account data, but not change billing info, or initiate purchases over a certain amount. And so, what it means is that authorization shifts from like historically simple scopes to more of like a capability based permission. And there's an extension to OAuth called RAR that like covers like much more granular much more granular permissions, that are associated with an authorization request. Um, Visibility becomes really important. So you need to kind of have clear logs of like what the agent did, notifications for sensitive actions, controls to sort of pause or even maybe revoke the agent. Yeah, I think like the real basic fact is that like authorization kind of needs to become much more granular in the agent world.
So that's kind of the authorization side of things, which, you know, you've got to
Yeah.
make sure you've got the right scope, right, for permissions and things like that.
hmm
The authentication level, though, I think is somewhat similar to a human, especially an agentic. I've had this thought before where like it seems like the behavior of an agentic identity tends to be more familiar or more aligned with like a human. Does that extend also on the authentication side of things?
So yeah, this is great. I think fundamentally, like if you think about it this way, like humans prove identity through factors, right? So we've relied on things like passwords or biometrics, or OTP codes or device trust, right? Those are human verification factors, and um, agents don't really have those, right? Like they should be authenticating, like what we kind of refer to as like a cryptographic identity. So they're, things like a private key or a
Some sort of
certificate.
certificate was what I was thinking.
Right,
Yeah.
or a token a bound token, right? And those and the system here is for sort of verifying the software workload rather than the person when an agent authenticates, right? Um, and then you think about the fact that like humans authenticate interactively, right? They're typing a password, they're approving a push notification. Agents authenticate machine to machine, so they're often using protocols like OAuth. Token exchange is another good example we can talk through later. But the system isn't verifying intent through like interaction like it would with a human. It's verifying the integrity of the calling agent, right? Um, and then you think about the fact that like, well, humans authenticate once per session. Typically, they might log in once and they stay in the session for hours or days. Agents behave differently. They may be requesting tokens frequently. They may be running background jobs and may be operating continuously. So identity systems have to be able to handle like higher authentication and token exchange frequency um, with agents. And I think, the last point I would make is that humans typically represent themselves, agents represent someone else, right? So a human logs in as themselves, an AI agent almost always logs in on behalf of someone else in the customer side. This means that identity system has to track multiple things: who the agent is, who the human is, and what sort of delegation exists between that human to that agent. So the delegation relationship is really kind of the added complexity here with that.
So I feel like platforms in the consumer space like this, like yourselves, have been spending a lot of time like trying to stop bots right from accessing accounts. And now it's like, oh no, like we want
Yeah,
these bots to come in, but how do we do that? Like, how do you see this actually playing out in a CIAM sort of platform where you're used to click the prove you're not a robot, and now I think you probably need to start to allow
yeah.
bots, right, to come in. Like, how does that look from your perspective?
Well, it's I think actually one of the CISOs I talked to recently was talking about the concept of like good bots versus bad bots. You know what I mean? Like you keep the bad bots out on the good bots in, and actually not that different from authenticating humans, right? You let the good humans in, you keep the bad humans out. Um, but it's interesting. Like if you look in history, like uh, we've seen like I guess um, agents acting on behalf of consumers for a while, right? Like um, we've had financial aggregators for a long time. You think about platforms like Plaid or Yodlee, where they're logging into bank accounts, they're pulling transactions, they're moving data between services automatically. Like we've actually been thinking about this problem long before the AI, the AI agent world, right? So, you think about like beyond that, like we've had automation platforms like Zapier, Make, or IFTTT, which are sort of increasingly connected to consumer services. They might be like moving order data to a spreadsheet, or saving your receipts from your email to your Google Drive, right? So, from an identity systems perspective, that's software. That's a bot performing repeated actions using the customer's identity. Um, you're starting to see AI assistants interact more with services. You think about like the smart home or the voice ecosystems that we have, Google Assistant or Siri. I don't want to trigger anybody's phone. They're purchasing items. They're controlling services. And then I think like one thing we're also seeing is like customer support automation. So companies are sort of experimenting with how do they handle sort of the customer support challenge using these agents. Um, and so like I think what I'm trying to get is that we've kind of seen like these autonomous bots, agents, accessing systems for a while. Like we're just kind of seeing it play out in a different way with much more intelligent autonomous systems behind it.
I think the wrinkle for me here is the word agentic, because everything you kind of described was pretty predictable patterns, right? It was, this
Right.
is the transaction I'm doing. And I kind of led that question earlier with like the behavior in an agentic identity is more similar to a human browsing and checking for things. Maybe it's, pricing, maybe it's enrollment or whatever it may be. And the idea of letting a good bot in and keeping a bad bot out, I find interesting, because how do you know which is which?
Yeah, and it really comes down to like that delegation model, like that being able to sort of tie that agent that's coming in to a human identity behind it, right? Like that's so you're sort of like verifying the human as well as the bot, if that makes sense.
So
Yeah.
it's not only using that agentic ID for API access, right? Because I'm kind of thinking like I've set up Claudebot, or what do you call it, OpenClaw, and it's essentially you can have it browse with a Google Chrome browser. I think it kind of presents itself as a headless browser, right?
Right. So like in the case you're talking about is like, can you actually tell that it's an agent driving the browser versus an actual agent that's more directly connecting to your platform. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's definitely a challenge that the industry is struggling with. And there's some other interesting approaches around that, where like you have to sit more in the browser rather than being sort of an identity system that these platforms are connecting to.
I think
Yeah,
why that's interesting to me and why I brought it up is that,
yeah,
my next question was going to be, if I was to try to roll my own and kind of
yeah,
manage this, you know, my original thinking when we were getting prepared for this discussion was, okay, somebody writes an app that can, basically act as an assistant. It can go and transfer money for me. It
yeah,
can buy an espresso machine. It can do all these things. But it could just be Joe Q Public set up Claudebot, or let's think 6 months down the road, it could be Joe Q Public using uh, Cowork, Claude Cowork, or
mhm,
whatever other instantiations there are of AI assistants out there. So now it's not just an app through an app store that maybe has, you know, some kind of central force behind it, but it's individuals. So the use cases to me seem like really, really broad. If I wanted to roll my own, I guess to bring this back to a question,
Yeah.
it's if I wanted to roll my own, what would I have to do in order to do that? What are the puzzle pieces I need?
Yeah, so if you're going to roll your own agent, the first thing I would do is to start to model the agent as a delegated actor, right? You're going to keep hearing me repeat this, but that the like you shouldn't treat the agent like a new customer identity. You should treat it as a delegated actor acting on behalf of a user, right? So your model kind of becomes like the user is talking to the agent, which is talking to the application, and that relationship should be preserved, so that every action can be tracked back to that real user, right? That's the first thing I would say. So modeling the agent as a delegated actor, um, using existing identity standards. Again, going to repeat that a lot, instead of inventing new ones. The good news is you don't need entirely new protocols. A lot of the building blocks are already there in OAuth and OpenID Connect. The token exchange extension to OAuth is very useful here, and it's actually the basis of our solution. There's a concept I won't go into too much, but in sort of protecting the agent itself and using a concept called proof of possession, which is sort of like giving that agent a cryptographic key to be able to come back to you and say yes, this is me, right? Like sort of protecting the agent identity. And then what you're doing here is you're allowing the agent to authenticate as a workload, and then obtain a delegated token tied to the user, right? Um, and so then you need to focus on the authorization design. So, agent for the agent itself, like authentication is the easy part. The real challenge is like, what is the agent allowed to do? So you need to think about like using capability based permissions. So like, instead of saying you have the ability to transfer money, saying you have the ability to transfer money up to $50, right? That's would be like a capability based permission. Strict scoping, limits on the actions, so you're sort of putting guardrails around what the agents can do. Um, and then, one thing to note is that you can add human approval for sensitive actions. So later in the process, I mean, you've probably seen this if you've ever played with like Claude Code or any of the local tools where you're in the middle of a session. It's like, hey, I need to go do some stuff on your disk. Because are you cool with that? And you click allow, right? So that's like a high impact action where you could add like a step up approval flow, right? It could be as simple as like a push to accept to a phone, or you just clicking allow, right? And then that activity should be visible, so you need to like um, really think about observability. So, your system should log like which agent acted, what user they represented, like what action was performed, what policy allowed it. So if you're sort of tracking all those things, you're going to be in a much better place to be able to be accountable when things happen. Um, and so that's kind of those are kind of the thing, I guess, the five things I would focus on, if you were going to roll your own solution.
The build versus buy analysis sounds a lot like when you're doing human only. I mean, it's
Yeah.
that, but maybe a tad more. Um, I also was just thinking as you're talking, the two main use cases I think are either you're consuming services or you're providing services. Which side of that equation does Strivacity help me with? So if I'm building the consumer app or I'm setting up an API to buy my goods.
Yeah. Um, so as a CIAM platform, we sit on the consumer side. So we can sit on the consumer application side of the interaction, and so we're the system that's responsible for authenticating the customer, managing their account, their identity, enforcing policies on um, what actions are allowed. So when an AI agent acts on behalf of a user, Strivacity kind of governs the identity behind the the action. So we kind of become the control point between the user and the service. So what the architecture kind of looks like is like, a user is talking to an AI agent, which is talking to the consumer application, which is talking to a backend service API. So we sit right at the identity boundary between the agent user and the application resources. And our job is to determine who is the user, which agent is acting for them, what the agent is allowed to do. And so we anchor the consumer identity, but we also become the authorization layer for downstream services. So when an agent tries to perform something like initiating a payment or updating account information, we are issuing the tokens and we're controlling the policies that determine whether that service API should allow that action to happen. If that makes sense.
Yeah, no, that totally makes sense. Now I'd like to just understand, is your approach based on open standards? Like you started off talking
Yeah.
about OpenID Connect and OAuth 2. Are you using the OpenID standards or is it proprietary?
Yeah.
And why does it matter?
Yeah, so totally we're built on widely adopted identity standards, OAuth 2, OpenID Connect, token exchange, which is like I said is an extension of the OAuth protocol, and some proof of possession techniques. So that's sort of the cryptographic control over the agent authentication itself. So things like Depop, which is a proof of possession extension to OAuth, and MTLS is another example of like where you're basically just exchanging certificates between a client and server, right? So these standards are already out there, right? They're already powering modern identity systems. They're extending them to kind of extending them to agents kind of means practitioners don't have to adopt like a new model, right? So some reasons as to why we would and why that's important, or why the distinction matters is like, to me, um like these are battle tested identity standards, right? Like they've been out there for years. They've gone through security audits. They've gone through large scale deployments. They're continuously improved on by the standards bodies. That's super important, right? And so what that means is that you're building this agent identity framework on a foundation that's proven, right? It's not experimental. I think that's super important. Um, you won't hear most vendors say this, but you do sort of, it sort of helps the vendor lock-in problem a little bit. So like if you were proprietary, organizations kind of get trapped inside your ecosystem. If you use open standards, um, agents can move between platforms. Enterprises retain some architectural flexibility, right? Security models remain transparent. So, you won't hear most vendors say that, but it is a benefit of using open standards. Um, and I think so. I think really like kind of tying it all together is that like standards help us converge on safe patterns, right? We've figured out how agents should authenticate and act on behalf of users. If we build on top of open standards, we can gradually converge on shared patterns for like the delegation problem, the human approval problem, the capability based authorization, the auditability of it all, right? So that's kind of why we chose to go that direction, and we've always kind of been a very standards friendly vendor.
Well, I'm sure OpenID Foundation appreciates that. I think a lot of people do because I think standards really kind of help make the world go round.
Hmm.
So
Yeah.
I see that as a plus, for sure. I want to get a little more into the weeds around
Okay.
how this actually works because I'm trying to you know, wrap my head around this idea of, okay, I've got a human. In the case of a consumer IAM platform, I might have millions of users, right? Maybe
Hmm.
even billions, but let's
Yeah.
stick with millions. So I have fewer commas to deal with in my brain. Millions of users, and each of those million users could have any number of delegated agents.
Hmm.
Can agents be shared amongst users? Maybe it's like a family unit or an organizational unit that maybe has a shared sort of bot. I'm curious, like, how do you represent this when it comes to try and map those relationships, especially in the consumer space where you're dealing with orders of magnitude higher than maybe like a normal enterprise might see?
Yeah, no, I mean it again, it really comes down to the delegation model. So there is no reason why a single person couldn't delegate authority to multiple agents, right? It's just an approval, you would sort of have like an approval workflow that user goes through to say, hey, yes, I am authorizing this agent to, you know, be able to execute these specific actions on my behalf, right? So, so that would sort of be modeled within your product in terms of like, well, what agents have I actually approved, to operate on my behalf? Um, what rights did I give them? Like, how long are they able to? What's the length of of time that I'm allowing them to act for me, until I have to sort of reauthorize them in the future. This all really that isn't that different than like the standard sort of CIAM problem where you're sort of logging into a service and you're granted a session for some period of time, and then at some point you have to kind of go back and reapprove it in the future, right? So really nothing stopping you having multiple agents that have been delegated to act on your behalf. And one of the things we're also thinking about at Strivacity is like, well, how do we actually give customers control over that, right? So they provide them with an interface, a my agents interface, maybe, where they can kind of go in and say, oh no, you know what, I don't like that one. I'm gonna revoke their access at this point, right, before it expires, right? So yeah, I mean, that's kind of the idea around it.
So you kind of, pre-answered the next question I was going to have. It seems like we're bleeding a little bit into a space that's traditionally been called IGA, Identity Governance Administration, or identity governance type solutions.
Mhm.
Now you're talking about, okay, well, me as a consumer, what does that my agent interface look like? It's almost like, and maybe I'm just kind of reading between the lines. Am I
Yeah.
doing access reviews essentially on all the agents that have access to my things? Like, what does that look like?
I would think it's more like session management, so if you think of like most sites that have sort of a like a my account portal where you're sort of going into the portal and what MFA do I have set up? What sessions or where have I logged in from? Oh well, wow, somebody logged in from some remote part of the world. I don't know what that is, so maybe I ought to kill that session, right? So to me, it's more of like a not like a customer doing like a personal access review or an access review. It's more like me just having vision into like who's acting on my behalf and when did I approve them and giving me control over being able to revoke those, right? So it's more of like a personal control thing rather than like a. But yes, it is a governance thing. It's just I think I would sort of more equate it with like the like device manage session management interface than I would sort of a full sort of IGA interface.
I assume that would stretch into other sort of, non-human interfaces like API keys, things like that. I think the dangers of like, unattended and API keys are probably pretty well known, but is this another point where it's like, okay, agents are going to start to leverage these keys and you really have to make sure that your API keys are solid, secure, and that you're pruning them when needed?
API keys have been around forever. It's a simple way to authenticate software, but it's also one of the weakest ways to authenticate software. They're essentially shared secrets, right? If you possess the key, in most cases, if you possess the key, the system assumes that you're the authorized caller. Um, and that works for simple service integrations. But I would say it has major limitations when agents are involved because the key is not necessarily tied to like a specific agent. It doesn't prove who's actually using it. Uh, it's often long lived, which is not necessarily a great thing. And then I would sort of build upon the delegation conversation where I would say that API keys don't really support the delegation model well. So um, uh, you know, agentic AI kind of introduces a new requirement, right? Acting on behalf of a user. So API keys typically represent an application and not a relationship, if that makes sense. So if an agent uses an API key, it's kind of hard to answer questions like, well, which user authorized this, or what authority did they grant, or when did they, when should that authority expire? So that's why token-based models like OAuth, token exchange become much more important here, right? And so I think it was kind of a natural place for us to start with agents is like use an API key, use a simple client credentials grant. But I think we need to sort of evolve our thinking. And then, key leakage is a major real world risk. I mean, API keys get exposed all the time. They get committed to source code repositories. They appear in logs. They leak through client side applications. Like like
GitHub.
they're problematic. And they enable impersonation and replay. So there's a lot of problems. A lot of problems with it. And I think the safer pattern is short-lived scoped tokens. A modern identity system kind of replaces API keys with a short-lived access token. Again, capability-based permissions, proof of possession, delegated identity claims. These are the things we should be thinking about with these types of interactions rather than API keys.
Do you see agentic identity as sort of like a a, a way for API keys to start to go away? Like, is this the beginning of,
Oh
hey, you
wow.
know what? Maybe we've used them for years, and it's kind of like the password, right? And a pass key. We've been trying to kill the password for decades.
Yeah.
We're not there yet, but it's getting better, right? Passkeys have come along. Like, where are we at in the life cycle of an API key? Is it something else?
I appreciate your optimism there, Jeff,
I'm not saying
but
it's going to happen anytime soon. I'm just wondering if
yeah,
this is the beginning of that.
I mean, you do touch on a key thing is that people like simple, right? API keys are simple. I just want to connect my thing to this backend data and have it do things. So I think that that's a challenge for our industry is providing a equally simple way for agents to do things the right way rather than use a weaker API key. So um, I don't it's interesting. It's like kind of the password versus passkey discussion, where like it took us a long time for passkeys to get out there and really widely used and now they are, right? And now we're actually having discussions. Like I have customers all the time talking about like, oh, like I'm going to use Fido for our login and we're not going to use passwords. Like this is a greenfield solution and so like there's hope, I guess, There's hope. But
I
I
mean, I
don't
would
know.
measure this in this transition in decades, not in years, because we're dealing with enterprises, and
Yeah.
enterprises have built their applications, a lot of it based on API-based authentication, and so you need keys for that.
Yeah.
I'm just curious if, like, from your, in your projection hat of projecting into the future, like, do you see this as like the very beginnings, maybe, of API keys becoming less of the desired format?
Definitely. I mean, definitely. I think I think it's a really good point. And I think specifically, extensions like token exchange really do a much better job at sort of providing scope down tokens to access APIs in a way that's much safer and much more auditable. So, I guess you could make the argument that like the AI agent sort of progression explosion maybe pushes us more towards safer models of accessing APIs versus API keys. I like that. It's a good angle. I like it.
That's why I come on Identity Center to get little
Yeah, I
nuggets
love
like
it.
that.
Yeah, yeah. I hadn't thought of it that way, but that's a really good point. Yeah.
All right, well, I'll take that as a win. You're definitely now, one of my favorite guests, Stephen. So to answer your previous question, there we are.
Okay. Beautiful.
I want to kind of lump a couple things together because we talked about access and
Hmm.
agentic and APIs, right? We're talking about non-humans essentially.
Yeah.
Where do things like proxies come in? Where do things like MCP servers and even like agent to agent protocols? I'm kind of lumped all those three things together to some
Yeah.
degree, but like, how do you see those things impacting, what it is that you guys do?
Let's talk about MCP because I think it's really interesting to bring into this conversation. And so I mean I know quite a few of your guests have talked through MCP in the last couple episodes you've done around this, but MCP essentially a bridge between agents and APIs, right? If you sort of break it down to the most base level, so it sort of provides a standard way for AI agents to discover and call tools or APIs. So instead of sort of hard coding integrations, MCP allows an agent to sort of dynamically understand, well, what tools exist, what parameters do they accept, and what actions do they perform. So um, you know, one thing to note is that identity authorization still sits outside of MCP. So it's not necessarily, MCP is not solving the authentication or authorization problem for you. So when an agent actually calls an API through MCP, it still needs credentials, it still needs an access token. It still should have some sort of delegated authorization. So you're sort of tracking it through the entire process. And so that's where an identity system like Strivacity would come in. So the agent might authenticate to the identity provider, receive a delegated token tied to a user, and then use that token when calling the API via MCP, right? And so you're sort of still sit outside of the MCP server. So I actually would argue that MCP kind of increases the importance of strong identity controls, because you're you're making it easier for agents to discover and invoke APIs, which is a good thing and potentially a bad thing. If you don't have strong identity controls, you would end up with agents calling APIs unexpectedly, sensitive APIs unexpectedly. You could have agents accessing resources that they shouldn't, right? So an identity system like us kind of needs to ensure like the agent is authenticated, the action is authorized, the request is auditable, right? And I think that's an important aspect with regards to MCP. With proxies, I think it's a little bit of a more of a controversial topic, I guess. The A lot of service providers introduce API gateways or proxies in front of their services, right? And it lets them inspect requests, enforce authorization policies, validate tokens. But I think proxies can also become a bottleneck. And if you think about like agents, they're generating really high volumes of requests. The proxy layer can kind of become a bottleneck, a single point of failure, a latency amplifier. And I think specifically in the agentic world, they can weaken end-to-end identity guarantees. So proxies often terminate the identity context, and then the proxy validates a token, and then it forwards a simplified request onto the downstream services. And so those services might lose visibility into who the user was, which agent acted, what authorization scope was granted. So you kind of want, like in an agent world, you kind of want the identity context flowing end to end and not stopping at a gateway. Um, you know, other more controversial takes on this is that security responsibility can get blurred. So proxies can kind of create a perception that security is handled upstream. And backend services end up kind of trusting requests too much. But that's more of like a general discussion about like how to employ proxies within identity frameworks. But yeah, I mean that's kind of my take on the proxy side. I think the takeaway is like for agents, it's important to have that sort of end to end identity guarantee, right? Having an audit trail all the way down to the back end API of what happened.
Hey, Steve, when you're talking about
Yeah.
delegation, I
Mhm.
started to think about like the multi-agent scenario. Like
Yeah.
I want to delegate some of the authorizations, I guess, to other agents to work on just specific tasks.
Yep.
How do you kind of manage all that from, an auditability standpoint, just
Yeah.
a traceability standpoint?
Yeah. So the great thing about that is that particular challenge is embedded into the token exchange uh, uh, extension to OAuth, right? And Tobin, I think, talked about a little bit about this. I'm a big Tobin fanboy, apparently, but he talked about this in his pod. Um, but I think what I would say is like how do you make that audit trail like hold up to scrutiny? I would say start with the principle that delegation must never become anonymous, right? So that's a good soundbite there. So the biggest risk is that this delegated authority gets passed down the chain, and you lose sight of who ultimately authorized what. So in a subagent world, I would say that the rule would be, hey, a subagent must be linked to a parent agent must be linked to a real human or an accountable system owner. And every action must preserve that chain. And like I said, you can preserve that chain within the token model. So, that means like tokens that get passed around or exchanged, they need to carry context like who was the human subject, um, who was the primary agent, what were the sub agents that were actually executing tasks on behalf of that primary agent, what capabilities were granted, the policy or maybe some approval context if you want to carry that along. And I think that can all be embedded into the token model and sort of carried along with the tokens as they progress through your systems. Um, you need to use constrained delegation, and I think one of the podcasts you talked about scope attenuation, but the basic concept being that a parent agent should never hand off unlimited authority to a subagent, right? You should always attenuate their what they're allowed to do, and each hop in the chain should really be constrained by least privilege, maybe some time or resource limits, sort of setting explicit policy boundaries around the chain as it sort of goes down, throughout your system. So, yeah, that's kind of. I mean, I think ultimately, like audit logs, kind of need to read more like a chain of custody than like a debug log. So it holds up to scrutiny. If you can show who the human principal was, what parent agent received the delegation from the human, what subagents executed, what capabilities were used, then I think you're in pretty good shape in terms of being able to hold up to scrutiny on this.
This
Yeah.
this whole agentic AI IAM topic is just so fascinating,
Mm.
and I know as practitioners, we're all hopeful that we can leverage our existing investments and tools. I'm sure your customers feel that way as well. So, your existing Strivacity customers, I mean, are they looking at rebootstrapping based on, you know, taking all of the agentic AI use cases into account, or is this something that kind of adds into their existing deployment?
Yeah. Um, so I mean, like, selfishly, like a platform like ours would definitely give a head start, right? And in terms of solving this problem. I mean, I think if you're running a modern CIAM platform like Strivacity, like you're um, you're already using some pretty core identity primitives. Like you're probably using OAuth, you're probably using OpenID Connect, you're probably doing some policy driven authorization. You have a customer identity store where your customers live already. Um, you're doing event logging and audit trails already, and I think agentic AI doesn't really replace those foundations; it extends them, and that's how we're treating it. We're layering this into our platform. We're not sort of shipping a new product. We're literally saying, like, in our audit events, instead of just having like the human that logged in, there's now an actor column, right, where you can see like, oh, human plus actor, right? That's kind of how we're laying it down um, into our product. Now, some concepts do need to evolve, right? Delegated authority again is something that you need to be able to support. Um, being able to handle higher levels of machine to machine authentication, the whole capability based permission thing, is instead of simple scopes, because I think most organizations that are deploying CIAM are really thinking about it from a simple scope perspective and not really a capability perspective at this point. And I think that's kind of the position we're taking on it. That's kind of how we're seeing it.
I feel like there's so much more to cover, but
Yeah.
we want to keep this reasonable for people listening
Yeah.
to it. What is the one thing that somebody listening to this should take away to say, you've got to get this right? When
Mm.
we start talking about managing agentic identity, and obviously I didn't want to keep it specific maybe on the CIM side, the consumer side of things, but where it makes sense, like give me a sound bite, right, that we can use to say, hey, this is what you should be doing, folks.
So the one thing that has to be right is the accountability model. So before agentic AI goes anywhere near production, like you have to get the accountability model right. That means you need to be able to answer who's responsible for an action, right? And in practical terms, that means um, every agent must be tied to a real human. Every action must carry that identity chain, down through your systems. Every permission must be explicit and constrained. So the accountability model is of the utmost importance. You can't get that wrong. Um, and so I think if you think about like, well, why would I say that? Well, I think the agentic systems sort of uh, amplify mistakes is probably how I would think about it. A misconfigured permission or a compromised credential could lead to thousands of automated actions very quickly. So without a clear chain of accountability, you're going to really struggle to do governance. You're really going to struggle to do auditability. When it comes to regulatory challenges, you're going to struggle to be able to defend it, in front of a regulator. And then of course, you have the customer trust problem too, right? If you don't want to upset your customers because they'll go to your competitors, right?
Got to keep the customers happy.
Absolutely, yeah.
All right. Well, I promised Jim that we would talk baseball, and so I'm going to hand it over to him. But as we were kind of prepping for this episode, you mentioned simulation baseball, and I've played baseball video games in the past. But I'm assuming that's not what you meant, or do you mean something else completely? And then Jim, take it away for baseball at the center.
Well, yeah, thank you, Jeff, because this is like the moment I've been waiting for. Stephen, we're in the small minority of people who like baseball, at least that like baseball and identity. So you brought up the simulation baseball. Why don't we start there? I don't even know what that is.
Okay. So I think most of your listeners are probably familiar with fantasy baseball, right? So simulation baseball is different from fantasy baseball because you're not just like collecting players and tracking their real world stats, right? In simulation baseball, you're actually running a baseball team inside a simulated league. So it's like you're acting like the manager or general manager. You're building a roster. You're setting lineups. You're managing pitching rotations. You're making strategic decisions. So the games themselves are run using like a simulation software. The one that my league uses is called Diamond Mine Baseball, and it's basically what happens is it's based on player ability. So you draft a player, you pick a vintage or a year to simulate that player, and then you aggregate a team like that. So you can draft anybody from history. For example, like I could draft Cy Young or I could draft Barry Bonds. I pick the year that I want to use to put into the simulation, and then I aggregate a team around that concept. So the focus is really on like team construction and strategy rather than scoring points from like real life, games, right? Um, so like what makes it really appealing to me is that it kind of becomes a sandbox for baseball strategy. So if you're really into baseball, like you and I are, Jim, you can architect the team however you want. You can test different philosophies. Like, do you want to build around power versus pitching? Do you want to try small ball versus analytics driven lineups? Do you want to see how you kind of want to see how they play out? And, like I said, our simulations also include players from different eras. So you can explore fun sort of what if questions that, fantasy baseball can't really answer. So you can be like, how would Barry Bonds have actually fared against Cy Young, right? Two players from two completely different eras, right? So the league I'm in is actually 48 teams, all with different human owners, not agents. Haha. We actually get together once a year for a yearly draft. We and it's a few days of just me nerding out on baseball with friends that I've known for over 20 years. So yeah, that's my little
I
rundown.
was going to ask you how you knew they were not agents, but I guess getting together in the room is the answer.
Yeah, absolutely. I've laid eyes on them specifically. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah.
So question that I'm going to ask you, and then Jeff, prepare because I'm going to ask you the same. Who's your favorite player, either current or historical?
This is going to be a controversial one, but it's for me. I'm a Braves fan, so I grew up watching the Richmond Braves on TBS, and the my favorite player is Chipper Jones, historic of all time. Yeah, so
Why is that controversial?
Well, he was he's a controversial guy.
Was he? Okay.
The New Yorkers didn't really get along with them too much. So
I lived in Georgia for so long that he's like a folk hero there.
Totally, yeah.
How about you, Jeff?
Sammy Sosa. Only because that was the only season that I found baseball exciting was the home run chase between Sosa and McGuire. And, I'm a Cubs fan. If I do watch baseball, it'll be Chicago Cubs. And so that's it.
So that season brought kind of brought baseball back a little bit from
did.
the brink. Like, so yeah, that was a good season. Absolutely. I totally respect that answer, Jeff. I
I'm a
like it.
simple man. I just want to see home runs. I don't want to see a
It's fine.
1-0, 3-2 game. Like I tell you what, I'm not a baseball fan, but I have watched more baseball in the last year, 2 years maybe, than I have in probably the last few decades because the game has sped up. The pitch clock, things like that have definitely helped. It's no longer like a 5-hour thing. You can get a game in 2.5 hours.
Yeah.
So I do appreciate those types of things. That helps drive my interest, but I'm still a football guy.
Yeah. I agree about the speeding games up, and imagine this as an old curmudgeon about the rules. I definitely did not want a pitch clock. I did not want a clock in baseball. I mean, that's one of the things about that they've always said about baseball is that there's no clock in baseball. A game can go forever. And then they had the ghost runner on second, and they had the pitch clock. Anyway, I was actually not going to name my historical figure because I was sure one of you guys would have said Jackie Robinson. And I mean, just what he had to go through as a human being, in addition to playing baseball and being one of the best ever. So that's who I would have picked for sure. I'm still going to pick him, but I'm also going to name my other person, which is Aaron Judge. He's the current, captain of the Yankees.
Yeah.
And he's just a quality human being on top of being the best baseball player in the league. And I know that there's a controversial statement because a lot of people are going to say, no, it's Shohei. Like, he's clearly, he's Cy Young level pitcher, MVP level hitter.
Yeah.
Like, he wins the MVP every year, but Aaron Judge wins the MVP every year with just his bat and his glove in right field. Anyway.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think like, the comments about like games being 5 hours long. I mean, one of the things I like about baseball is that, like, especially once you get deep into games, if you really look close, like, there's always some strategy playing out, and if you know what to look for, and that to me, that's fascinating, right? They're always thinking about how do they approach this inning, how do they approach this batter. I think that's really fascinating, and I love sort of the hidden rules of baseball as well. Like, there's actually a book named that, I believe, that's interesting to read, but it's sort of like, what are all the rules that actually aren't in the rule books? But like, if you bean a player, like, you're probably going to get beaned, to like those kind of rules. Like those, those are the unwritten rules. Yeah, thank you. That's fascinating to me. I love that stuff. So,
yeah, and they call what you talked about the game within the game. I mean, if you're playing baseball, if you're in left field and there's a guy on first base, you have to be thinking about, if it's hit to me. Not only that, you need to be thinking about, if it's ground ball to me, if it's fly ball to me, what am I going to do?
Absolutely.
And if you catch that fly ball, if you catch a ground ball and you throw it to second base, that guy's going from first to third, almost automatically. And the whole crowd's going to be like, why did you do something so stupid? But think about it, like, it's just a momentary lapse.
Mm-hmm.
There's no place for momentary lapses in baseball.
No, there isn't. You've got to kind of have the entire game in your head at any one time and know what the best play is. But yeah, I mean, it's strategy, man. I love that. I love that aspect of baseball.
So, Jeff, did we convince you? Do you love baseball now?
No. It's just not my thing. I'm a football guy, then basketball, then hockey. And then
we still agree on
something else,
identity,
and then baseball.
though, right?
Yeah, definitely.
We all agree on identity.
Not everything has to be for everyone all the time. That's fine. Everybody can have individual interests. It's not that I just don't care about it, I guess, for lack of a better word. It's not that I don't appreciate the skill or anything like that. It's just it just doesn't interest me as much as it does for you guys.
Nobody's perfect,
Yeah, that's fine.
Yeah.
All right, let's leave it there. I'm not perfect, and I can live with that. Stephen, thank you so much for coming back. I hope you come back in the future as well. I hope to see you at conferences coming up here between Identiverse. I'm assuming will probably be out there in June.
Yep, I'll be there.
We can give you the official fist bump of gratitude.
Sweet.
Definitely want people to check out Strivacity. Again, the website, strivacity.com. We'll have links in our show notes to find that very easily, as well as your LinkedIn profile, Stephen, for people to connect. Maybe share their favorite baseball player of all time, or maybe, I don't know. I mean, so the all-time simulation baseball thing, I do find somewhat interesting because I think that's a unique spin that I haven't seen. I've played fantasy football for years. I haven't seen the idea of taking like Barry Sanders' 2,000-yard year versus, someone else like in the football side thing. Like, how do you construct a team, right? Something like that. So I might pick your brain a little bit on that one and see how that would work out. I
Sounds
see that
good.
being
Anytime.
interesting.
Anytime.
All right, let's go ahead and leave it there. Thanks, everybody, for watching and or listening. Check out our show notes for all the information. Find us on the web, idacpodcast.com. And thanks again to Stephen and Strivacity for sponsoring this episode. And we'll talk everyone in the next one.
You've been listening to Identity at the Center. We hope you've enjoyed the show. Make sure to like, rate, and review. And we'll be back soon. But in the meantime, hit the website at identityatthecenter.com. See you next time on Identity at the Center.